Hello, in this video I'm going to give an introduction to the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is a communicating body system that works using chemical messengers called hormones. So the endocrine system works very closely with the nervous system. Both of those systems are communicating systems in the body that coordinate homeostasis. They just do it in different ways. The nervous system uses high-speed electrical and chemical communication, whereas the endocrine system typically just uses chemical communication. The nervous system is very, very fast for communicating, but it's limited in where it can go. The nervous system can only communicate with body parts that have nerves, whereas the endocrine system, it works slower, but it can go everywhere in the body because it uses hormones that travel through the blood. So they do work differently. In order for a cell to react to a hormone, that particular cell has to have a receptor for the hormone. So target cells of a hormone are the cells that contain the receptor for the hormone. So if we have a cell, for example, that does not have a receptor for insulin, then that cell will do nothing when insulin is around. Hormones exert their effect by changing the physiology or the function of their target cell. The whole point of the hormone is to send a message to the cell, and that message is usually to start doing something or to stop doing something or to continue doing something. In either case, there's some sort of message that is sent to the target cell. So the endocrine system doesn't just use glands. The endocrine system includes organs such as glands like the thyroid gland and the adrenal glands, but it also includes tissues and cells in the body. And what all of these things have in common is that they secrete hormones. So you can have an entire organ secreting hormones, or just a small patch of tissue within another organ secreting a hormone, or you can have just a couple cells within an organ secreting hormones. An example of cells within an organ that secrete hormones is the G cells in the stomach. So we typically don't think of the stomach as an endocrine organ, but the stomach does produce hormones. And the G cells within the stomach produce a hormone called gastrin. So it doesn't have to be a whole entire organ whose job is just to make hormones. We're going to see endocrine cells and tissues in various other places in the body. So in order to be considered endocrine, the hormone has to be released into a body fluid such as blood. So oftentimes the hormone is going to travel through the blood, but sometimes hormones are released into other body fluids such as interstitial fluid. In either case, usually the hormone ends up in the bloodstream. So this picture is just showing you some examples of the major endocrine glands in the body. Up in the brain, we have the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, which are major endocrine organs. In the cervical region, we have the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. Sitting on top of the heart is the thymus gland. In the abdominal region, we have the pancreas, the adrenal glands. And down in the pelvic region, we have the ovaries in the female, and in the groin region, we have the testes in the male. So what does the word endocrine mean exactly, right? Well, to be considered an endocrine hormone, the chemical messenger has to be released into a body fluid such as blood and travel a far distance. Exocrine glands are not endocrine glands because they don't secrete hormones. They secrete non-hormonal substances onto an epithelial surface. So an example of an exocrine gland is the lacrimal gland up by the eyes, and the lacrimal gland produces tears that wash across the surface of the eye. Tears are not hormones, so the lacrimal gland is an exocrine gland. And then we have paracrine and autocrine signaling. Paracrine and autocrine signaling does involve chemical messengers. However, these chemical messengers don't travel far distances. Paracrine signaling is local signaling. So paracrine hormones tend to stay within the area that they are released. So they don't travel through the blood and travel a far distance. An example of paracrine signaling is what occurs during the inflammation process when you have an injury. So when an area becomes injured, the inflammation process occurs in order to aid healing. And paracrine hormones are released within the area of injury in order to cause inflammation, and that stays localized to the area of injury. We of course don't want the whole entire body to become inflamed, we just want that localized area to become inflamed, so we'll use local or paracrine signaling. And then there's an odd thing called autocrine signaling, which is a cell releasing a hormone that comes back and signals that same cell, which sounds weird, but it works in some cases. So here are some examples of endocrine hormones. Over here on the left, we see at the top cholesterol, and there are many different hormones derived from cholesterol. Cholesterol itself is not a hormone, but it can be used to make progesterone and estrogen, which are what we typically think of as the female hormones. It can be used to make testosterone, the male hormone, cortisol, which is a hormone that's important for stress and blood glucose regulation, and aldosterone, which is an important hormone for regulating the amount of water in the body. Over on the other side of the screen, we see insulin, which is important for regulating blood glucose levels. Insulin is a very large protein. It is not derived from cholesterol. It is considered a protein. And then there's a few other hormone examples on there: angiotensin II, thyroxine, and epinephrine. When we look at endocrine hormones, we can break them down into two major classifications: hydrophobic hormones and hydrophilic hormones. So the hydrophobic hormones are the hormones that do not mix with water. Typically, these are the hormones that are derived from cholesterol, but there are hydrophobic hormones that are not derived from cholesterol. The hydrophilic hormones love water. So these are typically the hormones based off of proteins and amino acids. And these two classifications are important because they will determine the mechanism of action for the hormone. So let's take a look at what this means. So we'll first look at the hydrophobic hormones. Most hydrophobic hormones, as I said, are derived from cholesterol, and cholesterol is a lipid, therefore it's hydrophobic. And don't forget that hydrophobic substances can cross cell membranes via simple diffusion. So when these hormones are released, they travel to their target cell, and when they get to the target cell, they cross the cell membrane via simple diffusion, and then this hydrophobic hormone will bind to receptors inside of the cell, typically inside of the cytoplasm or inside the nucleus. So here we have an example of a hydrophobic hormone, and this hormone will cross the cell membrane via simple diffusion, and then it binds to an intracellular receptor inside of the target cell. So like most endocrine hormones, the hydrophobic hormones travel through the bloodstream, and that's how they get to their target cells. But the hydrophobic hormones don't like the water in blood, so they need to be attached to a transporter protein as they travel through the bloodstream. Once the hormone is close to the target cell, the transporter protein will release the hormone, and then the hormone can enter the target cell via simple diffusion. And this, again, is because the hydrophobic hormone is hydrophobic, and hydrophobic substances can cross cell membranes via simple diffusion. Once the hormone is inside the cell, it will bind to a receptor, forming the hormone receptor complex. The hormone receptor complex typically then binds to DNA, altering gene expression. And this is a pretty big deal. Okay? So this hormone receptor complex might be telling the cell to make a protein that it previously was not making, or perhaps the hormone receptor complex is telling the cell to stop making a protein. Okay? It just kind of depends upon the type of hormone and the situation in the cell. In either case, though, these hydrophobic hormones typically alter gene expression, and that's how they change the function of their target cell. So here's a picture kind of describing the mechanism of action of a hydrophobic hormone. So here we can see the transporter protein in the bloodstream carrying the hydrophobic hormones. Then the hydrophobic hormone diffuses across the cell membrane of the target cell, entering the cell. In this particular example, the receptor for the hormone is inside of the nucleus. So that means the hormone has to enter the nucleus through nuclear pores and then bind to the receptor. The hormone receptor complex then binds to DNA, altering gene expression. In this particular example, this hormone receptor complex is causing the cell to make a protein that it wasn't making previously. Hydrophilic hormones are a little bit different. Like the hydrophobic hormones, the hydrophilic hormones do travel through the bloodstream, but they do not need to attach to a transporter protein because they are hydrophilic and they get along just fine with the water in the bloodstream. The hydrophilic hormones do not typically enter their target cell, and this is because the hydrophilic hormones cannot cross the cell membrane via simple diffusion. So instead, the hydrophilic hormones bind to receptors that are on the cell membrane. Once the hormone binds to the receptor on the cell membrane, it activates a second messenger system inside of the cell. The first messenger is the hydrophilic hormone. But once it binds to the receptor, a second messenger, which is inside the cell, becomes activated. And then this will lead to a series of reactions that will cause some sort of change in the target cell. So there will be a functional change in the target cell. It might not be a change in gene expression like we saw with the hydrophobic hormones, but there will be some sort of message sent to this target cell. In this picture here, in the top panel, what we're looking at is a cell membrane. Okay, and this is outside the cell, and this is inside the cell. Okay. Over here, this thing that looks like a weird goalpost, that is an insulin receptor. So that is a receptor that will bind to the hormone insulin. Okay. Notice that at this time, we have one of these green squiggles in the cell membrane. GLUT4 is a glucose transporter protein that allows cells to bring glucose into the cell. So in the top panel, we see what the situation looks like when there is no insulin hormone present. In the bottom panel, we see the situation when insulin is present. So we can see that the insulin hormone is now bound to the receptor, and once the insulin binds to the receptor, it activates a second messenger system inside the cell. And this leads to a series of changes. And ultimately, what has happened here is the functional change in the cell was to increase the number of glucose transporters in the cell membrane, causing the cell to transport more glucose into the cell. And this is how insulin is able to help us to reduce our blood sugar levels, because it tells cells to bring glucose into the cell. That reduces the amount of glucose in the blood. Notice that this particular hormone, the insulin hormone, does not actually enter the cell. That's because insulin is a hydrophilic hormone. This is another example of the mechanism of action for a hydrophilic hormone. Here we can see that the hydrophilic hormone is binding to a receptor in the cell membrane. So the receptor is not inside the cell, it's in the cell membrane. Once the hormone binds to the receptor, it activates a second messenger system inside the cell, which leads to a series of changes that cause something to happen within the cell. Our last topic to tackle here is what causes hormones to be released. So there are three main things that can cause hormones to be released: the humoral response, the nervous system, and other hormones. So humoral response, take a look at that one first. Your body's humors, that's an old-fashioned word for the fluids of your body, and typically it refers to blood. So the humoral response is talking about things in your blood that aren't hormones that can cause hormones to be released. An example of this is how insulin works. Glucose, in other words, sugar levels in the blood, are what causes the release of glucose. As glucose levels in the blood increase, the pancreas can detect this, and then the pancreas will release insulin, a hormone, that will then cause the glucose levels in the blood to decrease. So in that example, we have a non-hormonal substance, glucose, which is causing the release of the hormone insulin. Another thing that can cause hormones to be released is the nervous system. And this is pretty rare, but it does happen. One good example of this is the sympathetic nervous system causes the release of adrenaline by the adrenal glands. So adrenaline, don't forget, is really just epinephrine and norepinephrine. And when you're under that emergency mode sympathetic response, right, you get a surge in the release of adrenaline from the adrenal glands to help you with that fight or flight response. So in that case, we have the nervous system causing the release of a hormone. A very common way to release hormones, though, is to use other hormones. An example of this would be the release of thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is actually two hormones, T3 and T4, that are released by the thyroid gland. And these hormones help to regulate your body metabolism. What causes the release of T3 and T4 from the thyroid gland is another hormone, abbreviated TSH. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone, and what's nice is that the name tells you what it does. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. So TSH itself is a hormone that comes from the pituitary gland. So when the pituitary gland releases TSH, the TSH travels through the bloodstream to the thyroid gland, causing the release of T3 and T4. To add another example to this, right, is to look at what causes the release of TSH. What causes the release of TSH is another hormone, abbreviated TRH, which stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone. And that hormone comes from the hypothalamus. So we have three layers here. We have the hypothalamus releasing TRH to the pituitary, which causes the release of TSH at the pituitary. The TSH goes to the thyroid gland and causes the release of T3 and T4. So we have hormones causing the release of hormones causing the release of hormones.